Dan, should I go ahead and start presenting?
Yes, you can go ahead and start.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, let me know. Show of hands, if you can see the presentation.
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the water supply and demand assessment program within the Division of Water Rights. And my name is Paymon Alemi. I work in this section. And today is actually one of several public meetings to discuss this information. We'll have another meeting at Salinas on May 21st and a third meeting on June 3rd in Sacramento, which will also be offered as an online webcast that'll be recorded and posted to our section webpage. And so, just to give you an overview, I'm going to delve in with what water rights are, and then move on to the Division of Water Rights' response to the drought, and then zoom in a little further into the supply and demand assessment program before moving on to our selection process for watersheds, the pilot watersheds we already have, and the preliminary watersheds we're proposing. And finally, have some time for comments and questions. All right, so yeah, our division is within the State Water Board, and these are our 5 board members that you can see in the photo here. And the board meetings are public and in person at the Cal EPA headquarters building in Sacramento, with virtual options available for people who want to participate remotely. And we just posted the mission statement for the board here, which is to preserve, enhance, and restore the quality of California's water resources and drinking water for the protection of the environment, public health, and all beneficial uses. And this last part here is actually directly applicable to our program to ensure proper water resource allocation and efficient use for the benefit of present and future generations. All right, so what does the Division of Water Rights do? Well, first, for some reason I got kicked off as I was presenting, so let me reshare my presentation. Don't know why that happened. Let's see. Sorry about that. Let's resume. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, you're back up.
All right. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. All right. So the Division of Water Rights is a division within the State Water Board, and we're responsible for permitting the diversion and storage of water from surface water courses like streams and rivers. We set in-stream flow requirements, and we help manage water during drought conditions. And moving on to the next slide. And so what are water rights? Basically, a water right is something that gives you, as a diverter, the right to the use of reasonable amount of water for beneficial purposes, such as domestic use, irrigation, fire protection, recreation, so on and so forth. A water right is something that's known as a usufructuary right, which is a fancy word meaning that you don't own the water the state of California does, but you do have the right to use it beneficially. Water rights can be broken down into 2 main categories: riparian and appropriative. So riparian right is associated with the land contiguous to a river, or if there's a river, stream, or lake running through the property, that's considered riparian. Now, riparian rights have some restrictions. The water has to be used on the land itself. Can't be diverted off, to like a piece of property that's not adjacent to the river. The water cannot be stored seasonally, meaning, if it's dry during the winter or wet during the winter and then dry during the summer, you can't store it in a tank to save it for summer use. And it only applies to natural flow. I mean, artificial flows or foreign flows from dams, for example, that's not riparian. The priority system, well, they're generally senior to appropriative rights, but riparians have to share it with one another. You can't take so much water as it passes by,
Shoot, you got kicked off again, it looks like.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a recurrent because it happened twice. I don't know why it's I'll tell
Probably
you
the
what.
new recording.
It probably, I
thing.
think, yeah, it's messing things up. So maybe if I turn off my camera, won't happen. I'll give that a shot.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Okay. Otherwise, yeah, I think maybe they have to reconsider that policy if this is going to be an ongoing issue with presentations. All right, stop sharing. Let's present the teams. Resume on slide 7. All
You're
right,
back up.
so awesome. So basically, correlative sharing means you have to share with your neighbors. You can't take so much water that the folks downstream don't have any water left. The other major type of water right is appropriative. So appropriative, the property doesn't necessarily have to be next to the water course. You can store seasonally. Water can be exported, and it also extends to foreign flows. But they are lower in priority than riparian rights. And these can actually be broken down into two subcategories, pre-1914 and post-1914. The significance of 1914, that's when the Water Commission Act was passed, which established the great granddaddy of the Division of Water Rights, the Water Commission. And since then, anyone who wants to get a new appropriative right has to file. And those consist of permits, licenses, and registrations. Anyone who had a appropriative water right before that was grandfathered in. We call those pre-1914 appropriative rights. The priority system is based on the principle of first in time, first in right. The older the right, the higher the priority. Now, regardless of whether you're riparian or appropriative, if you have a water right, you have to report how much water you're diverting, storing, and using each month. These reports are done annually. The issue with this reporting we found in this division is that they're often error prone. I mean, sometimes data is missing, sometimes it's duplicated across years, across months. Sometimes people mean to report in gallons, but they report in acre feet, or vice versa, hence unit conversion errors. Sometimes you see multiple owners listed. So the point is that the data needs to be cleaned up in order to actually represent an accurate demand data set for any watershed. You can't just take it as it is and assume that it's right, because it's probably not. And building on that, so we did have a major drought, and in response, the State Water Board adopted urgency regulations in 2021 and 2022 to prevent the unreasonable use of water and to require curtailments to protect senior water right holders. And a methodology was established to determine how much water was available, and that in part was based on the demand data sets that I was talking about. And I'll dive into that a little bit further later on. But adjacent to this, to these emergency regs, there was also a voluntary water sharing program, which was established and developed with the local stakeholders as an alternative to curtailment. So this was a collaborative process where the Division of Water Rights and a diverse group of stakeholders uh, came up with this mechanism where senior right holders could give up a portion of their allocation and make that available to junior water right holders who would otherwise have limited water supply due to curtailment. So how were water allocations determined? Well, the first step was using observed and forecasted climate data, meaning temperature and precipitation data, to determine the hydrology in the watershed. How much water supply is there? The second step was developing a cleaned up demand data set. Take the data that people give you, and then you look for errors, QA/QC, troubleshoot, clean it up. That's your demand. The third component is using the water right priority system, meaning if it's something is a riparian or something is appropriative, how old is the right, considering that riparians are higher in priority than appropriatives, making allocations based on that on a monthly basis. And this is just a map here that shows how the Russian River is broken down into 28 subbasins. And so allocation determinations were made on a subbasin level, just to be more precise, rather than at an entire watershed level. Where does the supply and demand assessment program come in? Well, in 2022, this program was authorized, including 9 positions, and it was built upon the Russian River drought response. And we were awarded with a $15 million modeling contract with the consultant Paradigm and Environmental. And the goal is to provide data and tools to inform better planning and decision making during future droughts. And to take the methodology that was used in the Russian, and actually here's a screenshot of a visualization of the Russian, is take that work on the Russian, keep working on the Russian, we are, but take that and apply that to additional watersheds. And our goal is to make all of these tools open source and publicly accessible. And yes, so what are some of our goals for the future? Well, we want to keep doing forecasts for upcoming months as well as the water year. We want to consider different environmental flow scenarios. We want to account for climate change, modeling to predict how watersheds will respond to future climate scenarios. And then, so how do we determine what watersheds to go with? Well, in part, it's driven by surface water demand. I mean, if we have more data and if it's accurate data, then that's an area where the analysis is likely to succeed. We're concerned about areas that have salmon habitats or other important fisheries with known flow concerns. And we're specifically targeting watersheds in the North Coast, San Francisco Bay, and Central Coast regions, although this is not a formal requirement. And also important, we want to make sure we're not reinventing the wheel, that we're not doing something that's already being done. I mean, the division is already engaging in many modeling efforts. We don't want to replicate that unless there's some like additional value or insight that can be gained from modeling work at a sub-watershed level that would accelerate existing efforts. But we don't want to redo what other folks are doing. So that's something we're concerned about. Pilot watersheds. So these are watersheds where we as a program already have work underway with Paradigm. We've developed work plans and we've selected them. So the Navarro River, Napa River, and Butte Creek because of their unique characteristics. And I'm just going to dive briefly into each one. So the Navarro is a small watershed, it's coastal, and what's unique about it is there are a lot of small diversions, and it's also got a degraded coho, salmon, and steelhead trout habitat. So our contractor, Paradigm, is working on the supply side. Our staff, the Supply and Demand Assessment Section, or SDA for short, we're working on the demand data side of things. And the goal is take both of these things, the demand and the supply, and then hopefully be able to do allocations with that once we consider the water rights priority system. Same goes for Napa, which is another small watershed. What's interesting about this one, there's a ton of groundwater pumping, a ton of surface water and groundwater interactions, a lot of agriculture, and there are issues with you know flow. And similarly, a Paradigm is developing the supply model. We in the SDA we're working on the demand data set. And then Butte as a larger watershed is the third of the three pilots. Has a lot of imported water. It's home to a large population of Central Valley spring run Chinook salmon. And yeah, just like with the other two, SDA staff are working on finalizing the demand data set, and Paradigm is working on the hydrology model side of things. So, considering other watersheds, so these are underway, but I guess the purpose of this meeting is to go over additional watersheds we'd like to model and get feedback. So, in terms of selecting them, we've considered the hydrological complexity, the ecological significance, land use designations, water rights factors, and we've come up with preliminary tiers. And it's going to be an iterative process. So I have a map here that actually shows the preliminary watersheds that we've selected. So everything that you see in green, that's our preliminary selection, which consists of the Tamala Strait Bays, the San Francisco Bay region, Matoli River, Gualala River, Salmon Creek in South Fork Trinity, in the North Coast region, Carmel River in the Central Coast region, and the Upper Puda in the Central Valley region. The blue watersheds are our pilots plus the Russian. So the three that I talked about, Navarro, Napa, and Butte, plus the Russian. Anything that's red, we're excluding because the division is already engaging in modeling efforts. Anything that's gray, I mean, our program considered those, but they didn't make the cut for preliminary, although that may change depending on the feedback we get at these meetings. So I'm just going to go real briefly through each of the preliminary watersheds that we selected and just get into the reasoning and what makes them special. So Tamala Strait Bays, it's a coastal watershed. It received high scores for ecological criteria. In fact, San Francisco Bay Regional Board and CDFW nominated these because there are concerns about streams going dry. The next one, Upper Puda. It's unique. It has a water master. Actually, you see almost 2 million acre-feet annually of diversion, 410 water rights that are for non-domestic, non-municipal use. And so this actually received a high score for water rights just because there's a lot of water rights in the area. We have a lot of demand data. Another watershed that received ecological considerations, the Choli River, decent amount of diversion, about 1 million acre-feet. The demand is substantially more dependent on surface water than groundwater. And during summer months, we get critically low flows. And here's an interesting fact here. See if I can get the laser to work. 59% drought frequency. So see, that's something that we'd be interested in because we want to be able to monitor for drought conditions. Another one here, Gualala River, 54% drought frequency. Also received high scores for ecological criteria. And the demand is also highly dependent on surface water. Let me turn off that laser now. Salmon Creek, another one with high, this was actually nominated by the North Coast Regional Board. It's a chronic water supply issues. Not a big amount of diversion you see here. It's actually pretty small, 0.0156. So what does the mouth work out to? Like about 15 acre-feet per year. Only 19 water rights, but it's being considered because of ecological criteria. Next up, we have the South Fork of the Trinity. This has a fair amount of diversions. So I think the biggest out of all the preliminaries. It's about 3 million acre-feet annually, spread out among 52 water rights and 58% drought frequency. What's interesting is I don't think this number actually includes all the illegal cannabis diversions that are going on. So there's even more water use. And the regional board has developed the demand estimates for this use. And we have the Carmel River. It's got flow issues that have impacted steelhead that are protected under the Endangered Species Act. And this was actually nominated by 2 different boards, the Central Coast and Central Valley, due to high water demand and because it's an impaired watershed. And yeah, that's the list. And then if you have additional questions, you want additional information on our program, you can go to our website, which is www.waterboards.ca.gov/SDA. We have a fact sheet that's available. We're going to post the meeting slides after the meeting. And then before we wrap up, it's kind of as an interesting tangent. So there is a pilot telemetry project that's underway in the Russian River watershed. I mean, the water boards is researching and testing automated measurement and reporting. And we're looking for volunteers to participate in this project. And you can read more about the project at this website here, california.waterdata.org/projects/telemetry data project, or contact at the water boards. She is in the division, Laurel Dodgen. You can hit her up at laurel.dodgen@waterboards.ca.gov. And also subscribe and contact the Water Data Consortium. And then definitely if you have questions, comments, concerns about any of the watersheds that were identified here, email us at dwr-sda@waterboards.ca.gov. Comments are due by noon on June 17th, 2024. So I think that's 23 days or 24 days from now. And then again, yeah, if you want more information, hit up our website at www.waterboards.ca.gov/SDA. And you know what? That's all I got. So I'll just give it back up to Dan.
Thank you, Pamela. So basically, we're looking for input and comments on the preliminary watersheds and any that we did not consider that maybe we should be considering at this point, correct?
100%, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, so any questions or comments? Norman.
Sorry for the delay there. I got that little pop-up window you were talking about, Dan, where you have to agree to be recorded. It's like, whoa, didn't get that before. Yeah, Payman, that was a very enjoyable presentation, and I'm thinking about the modeling steps you described, and one of the watersheds, I think you called it Salmon Creek,
Yep.
seems almost like, given the low magnitude of diversions there, it's almost fits the category of, undisturbed. You could use that as a test case to see if some of your predictive methodologies are working, it would seem like. Because I think embedded down in there somewhere is a rainfall runoff type of predictive mechanism to predict on the supply side, if I'm understanding your methodological steps correctly.
That's a good point. Yeah. So, on the supply side, I'm sure runoff is considered, but basically, I mean, each watershed is different. For the Russian, we have a pair of models, PRMS and GS flow, and we feed the model. It's kind of a black box. We feed them temperature and precipitation data, and then we run them, and then it spits out hydrological flows. But yeah, if we do Salmon Creek, then I guess it'll be up to our contractor paradigm what model they want to run.
Yeah, and I think there's a piece of that, Norman, that is water supply versus water demand. So it is a smaller watershed, but for the amount of runoff that it receives, it has a higher water demand, water availability versus demand.
Okay.
Jesse?
Hi, yes, thank you, Dan. I just had a quick question about the Puda Creek watershed. I was trying to look at the map. It looks like the upper Puda above Monticello is what you're looking at, or are you looking at above and below Monticello? Just curious.
Looks like it's both of them, because I mean, I see
Okay.
Lake Berryessa here, and then it's just all of this stuff in green. So
Okay, so upstream
yeah.
and downstream. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. I just was curious if you were only looking at above the dam, what the rationale was for that, but okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, but I'll verify, because that's a good question. I'm just going off the map here.
There's also, for consideration, the Puda Accord, I think is what it's called, downstream of Lake Berryessa. So
yeah,
that will probably be taken into consideration.
There's also the beginning of the FERC relicensing process that's happening there as well. So I just thought there's probably some interest in that information for that process. Thank you.
And Jeremy?
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for presenting this to the group. I have two questions. The first one is, did you guys do these kind of models and assessments for anything in Southern California, and sort of what would make Southern California streams more appealing to the program? And the second one is, how did the program consider tribal cultural uses? Is it just salmon, or were there some other considerations that you guys incorporate? Thanks.
Yeah, good questions. I think with the Southern California. So full disclosure, I actually wasn't part of the team that developed the selections, but I think they were just considering all of these different criteria like hydrological complexity, water rights, and then there was feedback from our upper management and other agencies, and that's how they came up with the selection. The second question, I'll actually have to get back to you as to whether I think tribal resources were considered. I don't want to give you any wrong information, but I'll ask.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the feedback we'd be looking for. If there are watersheds in Southern California that we should be considering that are not on this list, well, they're not on the list, to go ahead and submit those comments for those watersheds. And Cody.
Hi, thank you for the presentation on this. Just a question. when you get all of the watersheds, the pilot watersheds, are you going to be conducting this research all at once? Is it going to be watershed by watershed with a priority order? And then also, do you have an idea of the number of watersheds you're looking for? It sounds like you're looking for watersheds beyond just the pilots, and I'm curious if there was a final number that you had in your head.
Well, initially we were hoping to do 30 watersheds because the reasoning was like about $500,000 for watershed, $15 million. But then I think realistically, given I think the timeline of the contract is probably going to be a smaller number. But however, I mean, many we can do. I mean, the more that we can do, the better. But there's not like one. No, it's just basically how fast the work will get done and how fast we get the feedback, and then like there's certain challenges that come up with modeling. Like these 3 pilot watersheds, it's taken us longer to model than we thought. So, and then we are actually working on them simultaneously. Like we have, I think, different subgroups that are working on each of them. So the goal is, yeah, to work on them in parallel.
Yeah, I think, like Payman said, that the constraint there is going to be the funding and the complexity of the watershed and ability to model them. Eric.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? I had to go through the extra step too.
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear
Yeah,
you.
sorry. Just to follow up on Jeremy's question, yeah, I think Jeremy, we can talk offline, but I know the only thing I was gonna, with the Fish and Game Commission's recent decision on southern steelhead, I think there might be some other considerations for Southern California watersheds, relative to the new position on the southern steelhead by the state, that kind of follow on, some of what Jeremy was asking about from the Region Board 9 perspective. And then also, as you know, Dan, we are working with the Division of Water Rights on some PRMS modeling in Southern California that is underway, Jeremy, that potentially could have some application here. So I just wanted to add those 2 points.
Yeah, and Eric, that would be additional information that would be great to provide to the team, is where, and for everybody, if there's existing hydrologic modeling efforts already occurring, to let them know, so that then, as we kind of move through this list, we can work on the demand side to clean that up and pair that with those models.
Okay, definitely. Sounds good.
Ted.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm curious about sort of plans for making these data available, what timeline we might be looking at, particularly for the pilot watersheds. I'm also curious if that will be accompanied by any sort of model documentation in terms of, kind of model assumptions, performance, validation, data, and so forth. And then I guess the second related question, maybe it's my third question now, is around any plans to do sort of stream flow, temporary or maybe even long-term stream flow gauging to support this program. I think, as we all know, the lack of stream gauges really hampers our ability to develop and test models throughout the state. And I'm just curious if this effort is being coordinated to any stream gauging efforts. So yeah, a lot in that comment and question, but I'd love to hear your response.
Yeah, that's fine. So let's start with the last question. So yeah, I mean, that's I think part of the reasoning for the Russian River telemetry project is to get more stream gauge data. We do have a telemetry unit, and they do want to get more stream gauges, but I think the limitation is just funding, and then working with the local stakeholders, getting cooperation. But yeah, I agree. I mean, I think some of these watersheds, the problem is there's just not enough actual flow data. And then as far as how much will be made public, I'm hoping that I mean, we have a GitHub for the Russian, but because like not everything is fully fleshed out yet, but it's not public. But I'm hoping that we could make the code public, for our allocation tool. as far as like making all the individual work plans public, like every single like assumption, that I'd have to actually defer to my program manager to see to what degree that stuff will be made public. I know the results like Power BI showing like the analysis, that'll be made public. The other stuff, I'll get back to you. And I guess was there another question in there that I missed? Sorry.
No, I think that was it. I'm just curious about the timing, I guess, of one.
Oh, the timing. Yeah.
Data being made available, and then the second, particularly the flow data, but also the supply, the demand data for that matter. And then I think the second question is around just model documentation, so we understand how to interpret the data.
Yeah. So I think the demand data will be made available publicly sooner because it already exists in a way. It's just because it's all reported on eRIMS, but it's just a matter of cleaning it up. I think the hydrology data will probably be slower because that's where we have to depend on our contractor to develop that. But the demand stuff is being handled in-house.
And I can post a link to the current spot where we have our cleaned up demand data sets for the Russian River and what we call the North Coast Policy Area for cannabis, which is the Eel north to Redwood Creek. And that we might be shifting that location over under the SDA program because it makes more sense than nested in drought. But the intent would be to post those demand data sets when they become available and finalized. Norman?
No, I don't have another question. Teams is really acting super bizarre on me this morning. I don't know why. I may have accidentally pushed that, but I don't know. Sorry about that.
I feel you, brother.
No problem. Any additional comments or questions? All right. So if you want to go back to just end it on your comments and how to submit comments.
Yep.
So you can submit them at this email address. Do you guys have a email blurb that you guys are shooting out? I want to say Lyris, but it's not Lyris anymore. Paymon, do you know? If you have
yeah. Oh, sorry. No, I didn't know that was yes, yeah, we do.
Maybe drop that in the
let me go find it.
Chat as well when you get a chance. So we'll drop that in the chat so you can be up to speed on any activities that the group has. And with that, thank you, Paymon.
Yeah. Okay, so here's how you would. Can I share my screen real quick? Not the PowerPoint, but where to go for the Lyris. All right, so I think the way that this works is, this is our web page. You would just come here and you'd punch in your email address and hit submit. You just do it to my personal email address. And then finish. And then I think if I were to go in here, I'd just get a notification. Trash. Oh, that went to my trash. Yeah, so California Water Board. Yeah. So that's it. That's the process.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Not a problem.
Next up, we have presentation by Sarah Yarnell on the allocation of environmental water budget using a functional flows adaptive implementation model.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Let's see. I may try the same thing Payman did where I keep my video off. Let's see how this goes with presenting. And then if I hit present here, do you still see the main screen?
Yes, we have the presentation.
Okay, great. And then I seem to have lost some of my, the only problem is I've lost some of my controls for, well, let's go forward. I don't have my controls in Teams to take my video off. So if I get booted off, we'll just deal with that as it goes. Okay. All right, so yeah, so thanks. I'm going to present today and kind of give everyone an update on some research we've been doing over at the Center for Watershed Sciences. This is in conjunction with some of the state water board folks in the Water Rights Division. And it's a longstanding study over the last couple of years trying to come up with a way to think about real-time allocation of an environmental flow budget in terms of whether that flow budget is set as an annual volume or as a % of unimpaired flows. How could we think about implementing environmental flow budget in real time as the water year progresses and you don't actually know what the total environmental flow budget would be at the beginning of the year. So my colleagues and I, work was led by myself and Jay Lund, and Lindsay Murdoch is the primary graduate student at UC Davis who put together and sort of really developed the functional flow adaptive implementation model, which is the name that we came up for the optimization model moving forward. Unfortunately, she's not able to be here today to present on some of her work, but I'll present here for her. And then we have several other folks, Francisco Viedo-Leyva, Cameron Carpenter, Lenny Calvo, and then Ryan Peak was involved early on in this project as well in order to work together to develop this. So, Okay, so the question we were presented with was, how could you take an environmental flow budget, specifically something like what the state board has been looking at in the Central Valley, 40% of a February to June unimpaired flow allocation? Could you reallocate that throughout the year while adaptively managing for changing hydrologic conditions as the water year develops? So essentially here, we're going to give you a budget, 40% of unimpaired flows, but you don't actually know the total value of that budget until you're at the end of the year, but you have to start making decisions early in the year in the winter in terms of operations. So we have some information. So of course, the unknown is the total volume available for the environmental flow budget until the end of the year. But we do have some information on runoff to date. So how much water have we received in the year so far? And then with the Bulletin 120s or other forecasting tools that are out there, you could have probabilistic forecasts of future runoff, right, that you could use to guide potentially your decisions as you move through the year. We also have information, there's different ways that you could design an environmental flow regime, and we wanted to build on the functional flows approach and the California environmental flows framework, right, that this group is very familiar with, that we've been working on for the last several years. So we also have this idea of natural functional flow metrics based on unimpaired flows that could potentially be helpful, particularly helpful in this case when we're really looking at a % of unimpaired flow range. So this was the question we were presented with, which really led to 3 study objectives that we had to deal with. So first of all, we needed to figure out what's the basis for shaping and shifting that allocated flow budget. We would take a functional flows approach to that, and I'll sort of talk through how we did that. We had to figure out how to adapt the approach to a variable flow budget, where that flow budget is not necessarily set by any particular water year type, but varies with unimpaired flows through time. So that was something we kind of had to figure out, and I'll talk through how that happened. And then we were asked to illustrate this operation. Could you actually show how this could be operated in an implementation setting based on these forecasts? And that's where the water optimization modeling that Jay Lund, that's sort of his specialty, and where he stepped in. So working together, we kind of had to apply the functional flows approach, come up with a water optimization model, and then figure out how to link these two together to get at this question that we had been. So we decided to use functional flows, right, as our basis for shaping and shifting these flows throughout the year. And there's 2 questions that come into how to design what those flow schedules should look like following a functional flows approach. One is how would we want to reshape the budget within an entirety of a given year? So again, if we're dealing with a budget in this case specifically that is only 40% from February to June, but we want to reallocate it, how do we want to reallocate it? So that's kind of getting at the idea of seasonality. And then how do we want to vary the flows from year to year, knowing that our budget is going to vary with that interannual flow variability that we have here in California. So we have to sort of consider how do we want to deal with that aspect. So in terms of quantifying flows, just a brief reminder, I'm hoping most folks are familiar with the California Environmental Flows Framework and functional flows because we've talked about it a lot. But the idea is that through CEF, in particular sections A and B, we can focus on key aspects of functional flow components of our natural hydrograph here in California. We have means to quantify and actually describe numerically what those different flow components might look like, both seasonally within a year and from year to year. What are the ranges of wet season base flows, for example, across all the years of record? We have ways in functional flow calculators and things like that that are available on the cef.ucdavis.edu website, and tools that we've developed to sort of determine what these ranges of functional flow metrics would look like from year to year. And in particular, really understanding that interannual variability in winter years, we're going to have typically higher magnitudes, longer dry seasons, maybe more frequent rain events. And so how do we capture this into the design of our functional flow hydrographs? So here's an example of what that environmental flow budget might look like on a Sierra River. And the idea here is that one of the proposals that's out there in terms of thinking about an environmental flow budget approach to environmental flows management is using this idea of 40%, for example, is just one example of many, of unimpaired flows from February to June. And so in any given year, it might represent the volume, might represent this green shaded area here that you're seeing under an unimpaired hydrograph. And of course, it's going to vary from year to year. So you might have bigger budgets in wetter years and smaller budget in dry years. And these can vary often by an order of magnitude. So here's just two examples, one from 2017 and then the same river in 2015. And you can see how much there is variability just in that 40%. So having to really take into account how do we relate these sort of annual flow volume budgets to design of an environmental flow regime that follows the functional flows approach. So the simplest way we began approaching this was to think about how those functional flow metrics actually vary with annual flow volume across the whole year. It turns out that most of the magnitude and timing metrics do vary. So here's an example of the range of, and it's sort of a different format that we've seen, the range of spring peak magnitudes, for example, and their frequency through time in terms of how often you might see various magnitudes. And then if we look at the associated annual flow volumes for that same period of record, we can see that there's a similar relationship and pattern to this. And so we can start to get a sense that a lot of our flow metrics are going to vary with that annual volume, which is kind of how wet a year is. And although we can look at annual flow volume, but we can also relate that annual flow volume as a percentile of annual flow. So if we're trying to think about an interpretation, what does it mean if I have a 2.5 or million acre foot annual flow volume? It's hard to really understand from a communication standpoint or even just a planning standpoint, like how wet or dry that is. But if we relate that annual flow volume to a water year volume percentile, like a percentile of annual flow based on that water year, we end up getting like a scale, right? From the driest years maybe being down at the 10th percentile of all the water years. The wetter years are higher. So here's 2017, which is our wettest year of record. And that's basically up here at the 99th percentile. So we can think about relating annual flow volume to the metrics. And I'll show a relationship of that actually works pretty well. And we can also translate that annual flow volume into a percentile or water year percentile that gives us a sense of how wet or dry, based on an index value, how wet or dry that year is. And you can see that these work pretty nicely. The nice thing about thinking about water year percentiles or percentile of annual flow is that there's more variability in this. This really reflects the true variability, interannual variability that we see from year to year. So this dashed line along the middle here, this might be the mean annual flow volume. And you can see that it's very rare that we actually get close to that value in any particular year. And even if we were to design, say, 3 water year types or even 5 water year types, there's going to be a lot of interannual variability that we might miss if we just think about categorizing flows or flow volumes into fewer types. So thinking about it more in this broad spectrum of water year percentiles allows us to really represent and see that full range of interannual variability that we get in California. So what we can do then is we can associate, thinking about how to move forward to design what a functional flow regime might look like. We can associate these functional flow metrics with annual flow volumes. And so here's a kind of conceptual diagram of what that might look like. You have a range of, for example, magnitudes. they will have an associated annual flow volume with them, and we can fit a relationship between those that essentially scales with that water year percentile. And then we can essentially use that as an index to sort of understand how wet or dry a particular year is. So this gives us a sort of different way of thinking about scaling what our environmental flow regimes might look like across wet and dry years. That's more variable than just thinking about like 3 water year types or 5 water year types. These relationships work really well when we look at a variety of rivers and sort of look at these types of scatter plots. We see really good fits for magnitudes of flow as well as the timing of flow. So here's one example from one of the rivers. This is flow magnitude over here across approximately 25 years of record. This is the associated water year percentile, which relates to the annual flow volume. You can see there's some scatter and variability through the points, but in essence, you get a pretty decent linear fit. And this allows us to have a relationship or an index value for how we might want to relate a functional flow metric value to a particular annual flow volume, right? So we can do this for all of the flow components, the 5 flow components that we have identified in California under the functional flows approach. For each flow component, then, we can come up with a rule set for how we might want to design or explain what that environmental flow regime might look like. So translating those functional flow metrics into an actual daily flow schedule that could be released downstream of the dam. So for the spring peak and recession, for example, we might design it so that the magnitude is scaling with that annual flow volume via this relationship that I just showed you, which is this, water year percentile index. We can think about the timing. It turns out that the timing also scales with annual flow volume, so that could be variable, or you could just manually set that. The duration of the recession can be calculated from the timing or the rate of change metrics. And the rate of change could be manually set to sort of describe how you might want to ramp up and ramp down from that spring recession. So we can look at these relationships between functional flow metrics and annual flow volumes, or the water year percentile. We can use that information with some other rules that, like you might see here in this table, and sort of design how to translate those ranges of functional flow metrics into a flow schedule. And we can do this for each of the 5 components. I'm just showing the spring peak one. Here's an example. But you essentially put together all of those pieces and come up with a designed hydrograph that reflects what your functional flow metrics are, that rule set that I just showed, and it can be associated with a particular water year percentile, right? So here's an example of, let's say that I have a water volume that I'm projecting. It looks like it's going to be a 35th percentile year, so a water volume associated with that 35th percentile. I can go use that rule set to design a functional flow regime that then has metrics that are scaled appropriately for that, based on the functional flow metrics or the natural unimpaired metrics for what that flow regime could be that's affiliated with that particular water year percentile. This, of course, has a flow volume underneath it. So essentially now this gives us a way to associate an annual flow volume that is affiliated with a water year percentile with a functional flow schedule for the whole year that is appropriately scaled based on our functional flow metrics for that flow volume and that percentile of water year. So when you put all of these together, for any annual flow volume, or essentially any volume budget, you end up with a series of recommended functional flows for any water year type that could be moving forward. So here's a range of designed functional flow regimes based on those functional flow metrics that are varying with the water year percentile and the associated budget associated with that water year percentile. So essentially, for every budget or any budget that might move forward, we can identify an appropriate functional flow schedule to release below the dam. And the fact that we're using water year percentile, or this indexed value, also gives us a sense of like how wet or dry that flow schedule is. So although there's only 5 hydrographs shown here, you can imagine that there's actually a continuous representation of a flow schedule for any of the percentiles, from scaling from lowest flows all the way up to the highest flows, right? And then they're sort of scaled appropriately based on those functional flow metrics. So this is basically a way then to allow us to get at these first two study objectives. How do we want to shape and shift the allocated flows? We take this functional flows approach kind of harking back to SEF sections A and B. We use those ranges of functional flow metrics to design a variable flow budget that scales appropriately with any annual flow volume based on a water year percentile approach for that river. And then we use those two aspects of input along with proposed flow budgets as inputs to a water optimization model that allows us to actually figure out what types of flows to release when you don't really know your full budget. So this is the optimization setting that comes in here at the third piece. So the other piece of known data we have is that although we don't know the flow budget, for example, starting in February, we don't know what the total unimpaired flow volume is going to be for that year. We can use the forecasted budgets like Bulletin 120. And so here's an example of a December 1st forecast for the Stanislaus River. They break down a probabilistic distribution of what the runoff is expected to look like. These are updated monthly, so they change through time. And so what you get then is at the early part of the year, you might have these forecasted budgets might be quite variable. There might be a pretty big range of what they're expecting that annual runoff volume to be. But over time, and they shift with changing water year, but over time they become more certain until you get to the actual known volume in time. So there's this probabilistic distribution, though, can be used in an optimization framework to essentially assess risk and weigh the differences of what these different flow budgets might look like and be used as input to the optimization model. And I'm going to walk through an example of what that looks like. So this is the modeling framework that was developed by Lindsay Murdoch for her as part of her dissertation work. We call it FAME, the Functional Flows Adaptive Implementation Model. And basically it's an optimization framework that provides recommendations on what environmental flow schedules should you release this month to make sure, based on the forecasted budgets for the year, in order to make sure there's water for the rest of the year, and what type of possible flow schedules can remain for the rest of the operating year, giving your range of possible flow budgets. So it's a two-stage optimization model that's making a decision in the current month, as well as a range of decisions that could be made in the future months, depending on how the water year extends. So here's kind of another flow chart of what FAME, this process of inputs into FAME might look like. So you have this design series of steps to design what those functional flow regimes might look like. This is what I walked through. We quantify the functional flow metrics. This is akin to Section A in SEF, or the California Environmental Flow Framework. If needed, you could adjust those metrics for channel conditions, for example, channel capacity or other non-flow limitations. This is akin to Section B of SEF. We go through a process of relating those final ecological flow criteria, or those ranges of functional flow metrics that come out of sections A and B, with annual flow volumes to come up with those relationships with water year percentile, and essentially assemble a series of functional flow schedules that vary with any available budget and or water year percentile that might come down. So that becomes an input to the model. We have these probabilistic forecasts of what we think flows might be. This could be the Bulletin 120s. As I said, that's what we used in our initial case study, but it could be other forecasts as well. I'm not going to go into the details of the model, but you can, Lindsay's master's thesis describes how the model works, and that's available on Jay Lund's website if you want to really dive into the math of the optimization model. But basically the output is a current flow decision in the first stage, as well as a range of possible flow decisions that come out of this. So let me walk through what the results of this look like for a particular operating year. So starting in February 1st, we have a little bit of an idea of what a potential range of budgets might be. With the February 1st forecast, they tend to be a little bit wide, and over time, over the course of the year, we know that they're going to narrow, they may move up or down. But the only information we have at the start of the year is this range of potential budget volumes that you might have of your 40% of February to June unimpaired flows. And so that's kind of the information you have to work with, right? So we have another way to look at that forecasted budget. It's set up as an exceedance curve, these 99th percentile down to 10th percentile exceedance curves, but that could also be looked at as the median or 50th percentile expectation with some distribution or range of potential budgets around it, right, is the way to think about that. So the optimization model takes this information along with our functional flow schedules that we've developed and designed, and it releases a decision of what flow to release in February. And in this case, maybe it's in this case, it's a little bit higher than what is due to weighting and risk assumptions. Might be, it's not always the median flow budget. There's some allocation and weighting rules that might shift it around in here based on what the probability distribution looks like moving forward. But you make a decision for the month of February, and then you have a range of potential flow decisions that could happen based on this distribution or uncertainty here. So as you move forward in time, you get updated information, and now you have a new budget. And it looks like in this case, you know, the year is trending drier, and maybe it looks like the annual runoff volumes are going to be lower, but they're getting a little bit more certain. So that range of uncertainty that you're seeing is narrowing a little bit. You also know how much water you released in February. So here's a way to look at how that distribution is changing. It's trending a little bit drier, but the width between the ranges of probable outcomes is narrowing. So the model takes that information into account. It subtracts out the water that's already been allocated in February, makes a new decision, which in this case would be a little bit of a lower wet season base flow, and has a new range of potential scenarios that flow regime options that might be projected into the future. And one thing you'll notice is that this range is also a little bit lower. The previous scale, it went up to about 7,000 CFS. So this is similarly adjusted for that slightly drier range of possibilities, right? So it's kind of allocating in real time. Moving forward into April, things don't look quite so bad. It's trending slightly wetter. The distribution is narrowing. We're getting a little bit more certain about what the budget is looking like. So that distribution shifts a little bit back towards the middle. This range of potential budgets is narrowing in. We make a new decision for April that takes into account the budget that's already been allocated in February and March, and you get a new distribution of potential flow regimes for the rest of the year, working with your budget. In May, same thing happens. It's trending about the same, but the distribution is getting narrower. So we see that the mean stays about the same, but the distribution gets narrower and more certain. We subtract out the previous allocations, and we make a decision for May and June that really encompasses the spring pulse and recession, which uses a large amount of the allocated water budget. And then again, we still have a range of potential dry season base flows, fall peaks in the remainder of the year that we could have based on this sort of narrowing range of uncertainty. By the time we get to the end of the season, we now usually by end of June, we know our final budget because our budget's based on February to June flows. So we now know the total volume we have. So we're here, we've landed on this final budget allocation, and the model takes that number and allocates it through the rest of the year, subtracting out. So the other thing you can see then is, so this graph shows essentially adaptively as you're managing in real time what your flow release decisions might have been based on how this budgeting was changing through the year. If you had perfect foresight and you knew what this final number was at the beginning of the year, that's what this green dashed line represents. And actually in this year, the model did pretty well. Because the budget, although it bounced around a little bit in the early part of the year, it stayed pretty consistent through the later part of the year. So the forecasts were fairly accurate in this year, which helped the model to do quite a bit better. We can also look at what water year percentile, right, these would have allocated, or what these flow regimes represent. And you could see that this water year was a pretty dry year, only a 32nd water year percentile. So that means it was in the lower third of drier annual flow volumes. And we have a flow regime schedule that then is scaled for that drier water year percentile. And you can see that it did bounce around a little bit. So if you were to look at the flow schedule it originally allocated back in February, that was more like a mean or a 55th percentile water year, a little bit more average. It started trending a little bit drier as the forecast got drier, but essentially balanced itself out pretty well. So this is just an example of how the output of FAME could work in real time. We've done a whole series of modeling. I know these graphs are really little and I don't really expect folks to be able to fully dive into the details of this, but essentially just to show, you can run through any given year and scenario. In wetter years, there tends to be more water available than the minimum functional flow regime might require. And so maybe there's some decisions about what can be done with that extra water year. In 2017, there's so much water that it's like they're spilling. But in particularly the moderate and dry years, you're potentially getting a pretty decent reallocation of 40% of the budget that might really hit that sort of trying to maintain that functionality of functional flows through time. So just to kind of wrap up, we were addressed with this question: how could you do this? Can you take a variable environmental flow budget, reallocate it through the year in an adaptive manner? And so we have suggested you could use functional flows as a basis for shaping and shifting, particularly SEF sections A and B. You can use those ranges of functional flow metrics, relate them to a variable flow budget, and FAME provides a way to use these forecast-informed operations in real time. So Lindsay's thesis is available, like I said, on Jay's Lens sites, and she really goes into the detail of the modeling. And we've also just this year published essentially a hypothetical case study, sort of illustrating a little bit of what I've gone through here and really talking about this idea of how you could allocate a variable environmental flow budget using FAME. And so the reference for that is here. Okay, I can't see my teams, so I'm going to go ahead and bounce out of presenting and stop sharing. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Let's see, Jason.
Hey, Sarah.
Hey, Jason, nice to see you.
Good to see you. This is really cool. I think I read about this in the Cal Water blog, but it's really cool to see it. I'm going to ping you later to ask if you can send me a copy of that paper.
Oh, yeah.
It's behind a paywall now for me.
Happy to share.
No, I'm very curious to hear if you've thought about implementing this in some other case studies, at an actual regulating facility, looking at that trade-off of, all those facilities have other legal requirements that they need to meet, maybe it's FERC downstream flows or, wintertime flood pool storage. And so like, as you start to layer in some of those real world constraints, at where, even if you were to give this a high priority, like how often our flow, is managing to those criteria versus this criteria?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so couple things I can speak to on that. So we're continuing to work with the state board on applying this approach specifically to the lower San Joaquin tribs as a demonstration of that Bay Delta objective in terms of like, okay, if you were going to do 40% of February through June on the lower San Joaquin, what could that look like? So we're continuing to work with them on that, more specifically for those rivers. There should be hopefully a technical report coming out later this year. That will, again, it's a proof of concept using real numbers on real rivers with real channel capacity constraints. Yeah. It doesn't fully, that work does not fully take into account how the reservoir might need to be operated in the wettest years. So for example, I think, well, okay, there's lots I could say about that, but let me just, to be brief, you run into issues when you have the reservoir needs to spill. So now the spill and flood control is going to override your environmental flow conditions. And that's really going to be in those wettest years, those wettest 10 to 15% of the years. And that might just be the way that it is, in which case then your environmental flow management is potentially going to take second priority to the flood management. And so you just do your flood management, and then at some point, as you work your way back into coming down off of those spill flows, you could design and make sure that you're sort of seamlessly sort of moving back into maybe an environmental flow type regime later in the year. The other thing I was going to comment on is that, and I know Ted's here too, is that there's a project that a whole variety of folks across the UCs are working on that's going to be looking at, it's called Co-Equal, and it's looking at Central Valley operations and how CalSim works. And one of the things we'd like to do is think about how you could use like a functional flows approach in those real-time operation models. And so whether or not we would actually, we're not necessarily going to come up with a FAME model, but thinking about this approach of an environmental water budget and how you would design a functional flow regime and how and when would you be able to meet that given all the other demands. That's kind of one of the questions we're looking to come at a little sideways in that project too. And that project is just getting going, but hopefully there should be more information for that over the next couple of years too.
Yeah, and that was kind of the second part I was going to follow up with is, after you do these sort of simulations and you have sort of a idealized environmental flow regime, if you were then to go back and look and see what sort of implications that has onto non-environmental water users,
Yep,
what sort of trade-offs are we looking at,
exactly.
especially if this is given high priority.
Yeah,
It's really
and
cool.
great
Really cool.
question, and we're hoping, and I'd love to keep working on that. That's definitely like the next steps is to
Cool.
get a little bit more detailed into that. But yeah,
Okay.
this project was just to highlight that it could be done. We can really
Yeah.
use these tools and think about doing this like in a real-time way, adaptively. So
No,
yeah,
the scaling is really interesting. I might need to get into the math.
yeah, happy to do it. There's a ton of details in the paper and in Lindsay's thesis and ultimately in this technical report for how exactly we go about doing that. But yeah,
Okay.
happy to chat
Thank
about
you.
that with anybody who's interested. Yep, thanks.
Thanks so much.
And we will send the presentation and thesis out through our email.
Okay, that's great. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments for Sarah? Seeing none. Thank you,
Okay.
Sarah.
All right, thanks a lot.
All right, so now we move to the roundtable. Does anybody have anything that they would like to share about environmental flow work going on in the state? Seeing no hands, so we can go ahead and conclude our meeting today. Thank you all for participating and look forward to our next one.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.